59 years old, in good health. I'm not working in the front line. So my type is not recommended to get vaccination.
Talking about common good, Wuhan virus vaccines are supposed to be a global public good. But what happens when a vaccine manufacturer starts bullying? Governments are silenced, supplies are halted, and profits take precedence over saving lives. I'm not describing a hypothetical situation here. I am describing what Pfizer is doing. The American pharma giant, it is doing all of this. It is bullying countries to submit to its demands. We first reported about this back in February this year. While countries like India are sending free vaccines to poorer nations, there are companies like Pfizer which are bullying governments. Pfizer asked to be compensated for the cost of any future lawsuits. Pfizer wanted Argentina to put, and listen to this, put its bank reserves, its military bases, and its embassy buildings at stake as collateral. These are Pfizer's demands. Look at this. Number one, Brazil waives the sovereignty of its assets abroad in favor of Pfizer. That the rules of the land be not applied on Pfizer. Number three, that Brazil take into consideration a delay in delivery. Number four, that Pfizer is not penalized for it, for a delay in delivery. And number five, in case of any side effects, Pfizer be exempted from all civil liability. 8 months have passed since we reported this. Pfizer has not changed. It is still putting profits above public health. It is still forcing governments to bend to its will. An advocacy group has thrown up more details of what Pfizer does. It has accessed some confidential contracts of Pfizer. And we have a copy. These contracts are with 9 countries and blocks, and the details are shocking. Desperate countries are being forced to make humiliating concessions to Pfizer. We went through the entire report. We found 6 very important points worth highlighting. Number one, Pfizer has the right to silence governments. It has forced countries to not talk about the deals they strike for shots. Number two, Pfizer controls the donations of its shots, not the country that buys them. Pfizer will decide where the shots go. Number three, Pfizer has secured an intellectual property waiver for itself, and this clause is particularly disturbing. If Pfizer is accused of intellectual property theft, governments will pay, not the company. Number four, if there are disputes, private arbitrators and not public courts will decide on them. Number five, Pfizer can go after state assets to secure its compensation. And number six, Pfizer calls the shots on all key decisions. It decides delivery timelines and more. These are very serious revelations. I'll give you some more details. Number one, Pfizer is silencing governments. How? Through contracts. These airtight contracts are at the center of everything. They can silence governments in ways you can't even imagine. Look at what happened in Brazil. Pfizer agreed to supply its Wuhan virus vaccines to Brazil. And it sneaked in this clause in the agreement to force Brazil to not share any specifics about its deal with Pfizer. Let me read it out for you. This is what it says. The Brazilian government is prohibited from making any public announcement concerning the existence, subject matter, or terms of the agreement, or commenting on its relationship with Pfizer without the prior written consent of the company. In other words, Brazil cannot talk about the Pfizer deal until it gets an approval from Pfizer in writing. This basically is a private company muzzling a government. And that's not all. Pfizer also gets to decide who'll get the shot. Suppose someone wants to donate Pfizer shots to Brazil. Can they do it? They cannot. The Pfizer agreement restricts Brazil from accepting donations. No one can donate Pfizer vaccines to this country. They cannot use the Pfizer shot until they buy it. What happens if Brazil does not comply with these rules? The consequences will be serious. Let me quote from the report again. If Brazil were to accept donated doses without Pfizer's permission, it would be considered an uncurable material breach of their agreement, allowing Pfizer to immediately terminate the agreement. Upon termination, Brazil would be required to pay the full price for any remaining contracted doses. So Brazil will have to cough up the entire payment, and Pfizer won't even have to supply the full consignment of Wuhan virus shots. What happens if someone accuses Pfizer of stealing its vaccine technology, of intellectual property theft? The government will be forced to defend Pfizer. It's unbelievable. We had to read this twice to let it sink in. And guess what? At least 4 countries have been forced to protect Pfizer's patent, meaning these governments are defending Pfizer for intellectual property theft, while the company is free to use anyone's intellectual property as it pleases. Colombia is one of these victims. I'll explain with an example. Suppose a domestic vaccine maker or any pharma company in Colombia goes to court and they accuse Pfizer of infringing their vaccine patent. Who will be the one fighting that case? Not Pfizer. Even though they're the accused party, it's not Pfizer and their lawyers who will be in court. It will be the Colombian government. The government will have to defend Pfizer. And if they lose the case, it will be the Colombian government that will have to pay the settlement, not Pfizer. What if these governments want to get out of these tough contracts? They won't be able to sue Pfizer at home. The matter will go to a secret panel of 3 private arbitrators in New York. Pfizer will be tried as per New York law and not the laws of the land where it sells vaccines. And these countries will pay heavily if they lose in arbitration. Pfizer can ask a government to shift control of state assets to compensate for losses. What kind of assets are we talking about here? Practically anything that a sovereign government owns: foreign bank accounts, foreign investments, commercial property, state-owned airlines, even oil companies. Pfizer can take over any or all of these from a government. Basically, everything happens on Pfizer terms once a country decides to buy its vaccine. Even the delivery of shots is decided by the company. In Brazil, in Albania, in Colombia, Pfizer gets to decide the delivery timetable for vaccines, and the countries will have to agree to whatever they're given, whenever they're given. Pfizer, of course, gets to decide the price. It sets the delivery timelines. It accepts accountability for nothing. And in case someone sues the company, it's the government that foots the bill for the damages, not Pfizer. There is no other way to describe Pfizer's business practices. This is vaccine terrorism.
You have the right to know the potential benefit of any intervention. For example, Pfizer reported that its vaccine shows a 95% efficacy. That sounds like it protects you 95% of the time, right? But that's not actually what that number means. That 95% refers to the relative risk reduction, but it doesn't tell you how much your overall risk is reduced by vaccination. For that, we need absolute risk reduction. In the Pfizer trial, 8 out of 18,198 people who were given the vaccine developed COVID-19. In the unvaccinated placebo group, 162 people got it, which means that even without the vaccine, the risk of contracting COVID-19 was extremely low at 0.88%, which the vaccine then reduced to 0.04%. So the net benefit, or the absolute risk reduction that you're being offered with a Pfizer vaccine, is 0.84%. That 95% number, that refers to the relative difference between 0.88 and 0.04%. That's what they call 95% relative risk reduction. And relative risk reduction is well known to be a misleading number, which is why the FDA recommends using absolute risk reduction instead. Which begs the question, how many people would have chosen to take the COVID-19 vaccines had they understood that they offered less than 1% benefit?
Which brings us on to Pfizer.
Another great success story. Pfizer, one of the great pharmaceutical companies. Well, actually, maybe not. Maybe not. This is a story that just broke this week. Researcher blows the whistle on data integrity issues and more with Pfizer's vaccine trial here. And this is the company that was subcontracted by Pfizer to do the clinical trials. Ventavia Research Group. So it's a very interesting story. Let's break it down because it has absolutely a huge bearing on everything that we've just said in the last few minutes here. So this is the British Medical Journal. So obviously this is a serious peer-reviewed medical journal here. And what they're saying is, well, what their investigative reporter, this is an investigative piece of journalism, revelations of poor practices at a contract research company helping to carry out Pfizer's pivotal COVID-19 vaccine trial raise questions about data integrity and regulatory oversight. Now, that's a very mild summary of the contents of this report. Let's just take a look at what's inside. The whistleblower is interesting, Brooke Jackson from Ventavia Research Group. And what happened is this particular employee saw all these things happening and basically spoke to her senior management. And just take a wild guess what happened. What was her reward for being such an honest, conscientious employee?
Well, in the UK, it'd be called a P45. In the United States, I guess it's called a pink slip. Is that right?
Sacked.
Yes,
sacked. So after Brooke Jackson was sacked, proceeded to go to the BMJ to blow the whistle here. This is what we are seeing in terms of the accusations, falsifying trial data. Well, that's always a good one, isn't it? Especially for vaccine trials for COVID-19. Unblinding staff and patients, so a total violation there of the integrity of the process. So staff were unblinded, but also it looks like possible patients were too. Poor laboratory management, all sorts of hygiene issues, syringes being left around and so forth, patient safety concerns, employed inadequately trained vaccinators, so people who didn't know what they were doing for administering vaccines, and not responsive to adverse reactions of patients. So basically taking their own sweet time whenever there was reports of serious adverse reactions of the people involved in the trial. So in other words, management, Pfizer, not too interested in that sort of thing. Of course, they don't really want to know if anybody had an adverse reaction. So this is just one of many things that would cast doubt on the actual claims made by these pharmaceutical companies about how well their trials are being conducted and so forth. And I might add, that doesn't even get into the whole issue of quoting relative risk reduction, 95% effective versus absolute risk reduction, which would be less than 1% effective. And by the way, these firms were told not to use that relative risk reduction statistic, and they're using it anyway. The reason they're using it is because they have spent so much money lobbying government and regulators and everybody else in government so that they can quote these huge numbers when in fact the real best practice is that's actually fraudulent representation of the results, and they should be quoting the true number. I mean, who would get the vaccine on an experimental emergency use authorization if it was less than 1% effective? Would you get it? Do you know anybody that would get it? So, I mean, so that's where we're at.
Every time that a variant appears in the world, our scientists are getting their hands around it. And they are researching to see if this variant can escape the protection of our vaccine. We haven't identified any yet, but we believe that it is likely that one day one of them will emerge. And we have built a process that within 95 days from the day that we identify a variant as a variant of concern, we will be able to have a vaccine tailor-made against this variant.
We were elected by the people. That's what the treaty says. But we should not forget that we are elected here for the people. We should have the best interests of people in mind, because that is the reason why they elected us here in the European Parliament. All these leaders of the European Parliament, they like to praise themselves every time when they go in a press conference to say that this is the most democratic institution of the European Union. The question to them is really so? Have you told these people in the Parliament, when you decided to strip their fundamental rights, why you have done it. You see, we have all these treaties, as my colleague said, that no medical treatment should be imposed on you unless you decide about it freely and under informed consent. Now, clearly what they do right now to condition the access in the parliament to have this green certificate is violating this freedom of people to choose what do they want to be vaccinated with or tested with. But there's the other aspect. And the question that I address not only to you in the parliament, but to every European citizen, to ask your own government. Were you properly informed about what is going on? Because we had a lot of debates at the beginning of this year in the parliament where we demanded full access to the contracts signed between these companies that produce the vaccines and the European Union. And I quote from an article in Euroactive, who says the following, it's an article from January 22nd, 2021, that says the following. The contract signed between pharmaceutical company and the European Commission in November of 2020 was made available to MAPS on Tuesday in a redacted format after the company agreed to open the contract up to scrutiny. Say what? Say what? So you're imposing a medical product on the European citizens without them knowing what's in these contracts? Not only them knowing, but us, we don't know. So after a lot of pressure in the parliament, as the article says, these contracts were disclosed to us and to the public. And I want to show you some of those pages. And you tell me if this is okay for the European citizens to be exposed to this situation where they cannot come to work, they cannot enter a store, they cannot go with their kids to schools, where they cannot freely move from one country to another, unless in one situation is vaccinated with one of these products. So these are the contracts that were disclosed by the Commission with the approval of the company. This is unheard of. And I will just show you the pages. These are the pages. You see?
They call this transparency these days.
So this is the fundamental principle, right, of democracy. I'm asking you guys, is this transparency? Do you see anything? Because we don't. European citizens' money have been given by Ursula von der Leyen to these companies. What happened with this money? What are they? Why are they open with the people and fully transparent? So we all know what is going on. The difference between tyranny and democracy is very simple. When the government knows everything about you, that's tyranny. I know how it is to live in tyranny. When you know everything about your government, that's democracy. So this is where we are right now, praising this institution. It's the most democratic institution in the European Union. And even us as MEPs, as directly elected by the people, for the people, we haven't been able to see in these contracts. So as we said last week, we are here for you, and we will fight for you. I know many of you are struggling all across Europe, and many of you working for the European institutions are struggling right now. But look, as a former US president said, freedom, liberty is one generation away from extinction. We live that type of time right now. And it's our duty and our call to fight for liberty. Thank you.
But if there's one message that needs to cut through all this, the vaccines are safe. I promise you, they are safe and effective. Listen to Dr. Fauci. Listen to the scientists who developed them through extensive and rigorous review. I did, and I took my shot publicly to demonstrate to the American people it's safe and effective. To address this challenge, We're going to launch a massive campaign to educate people about the vaccines, that they are safe and effective, and that they can go and get those shots and be good.